Hello and welcome to our 2026 winter, I guess, Bible study that we're going to do. My name is Valarie, and we hope that whoever joins us here with the recording, whoever's going to watch this later, will um, have a good time with all of us. That's what we want to do. We just want to learn together, and I'm so glad you're here. Today is January the 18th. And our plan is to do 10 weeks of Bible study on footsteps of Jesus. Now, when I started this uh, idea, the banner, I think, says footsteps of Jesus, and the handout says footprints of Jesus. So we're just going to figure out what the difference is at some point because we've used both words. Um, but I will. I can make a banner for you to put on your binder. Miss Pat likes to save the lessons and put them in the binder. She has all of them. Yeah. Oh, she has one that's thick, full. Can you hear Miss Pat when she's talking?
Kind of.
And I had to go back and I put all of the old ones, starting with the first one we did. The Women of the Bible was about that thick. And then I got all of those out. And now I've gotten down to my binder has only two on in it, but it's got Holy, Holy, Holy. And then it will have this one. And every time she makes one of those preface pages, I like for her to copy me one page. And that's what I put in the front of my folder.
And you guys can borrow the picture from the banner on our Facebook group and print it off too, whatever you want to do. That's just going to helps me keep track. And so let me share my screen and I'll tell you what I'm talking about. PowerPoint. There we go. Can you guys all see that?
Yes.
There we go. So I've got footsteps on the banner here, footsteps of Jesus. And I put the theme verse as John 8:12, and we'll look at that a little bit today. But the first thing, when I started thinking about footsteps of Jesus, which was not the direction I wanted to go in the first place, but that's okay. The God said to go this direction. Um, I've always heard that the Bible is an instruction manual for life, which sounds wonderful, but what does that even mean? I have a instruction manual. I just picked up one from my counter. This is my Pampered Chef Deluxe Cooking Blender manual. And I was looking at all the things in it and the things you would have in an instruction manual. And there's safeguards and caution, and there's a list of the parts, and there's picture a diagram with all the parts in it and how to use it and step 1 2 3 4, that kind of thing. Troubleshooting, it has troubleshooting in there. It has all that information of how to use something. And if the Bible is a manual, how do we use it? You've got, there's not a diagram for life. What if slot A and peg B doesn't fit together? How do we troubleshoot living life if the Bible is a manual for life? We got to figure out, how does this all work? What happens when life doesn't fit the instruction manual? And that's where we're going to go, I think, because the footprints of Jesus, I want to think about what exactly does God expect from me in the day to day. Um, we have this nice idea of what the Christian life should look like and how we're supposed to live our life. But churchy stuff, you've got the nice churchy version, and I need to know what it looks like on Monday morning when I don't feel very churchy.
Mm.
And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the footsteps of Jesus. In our last Bible study that we did, we started with verse. Oh, there's my slide that says the Bible is an instruction manual for life. Isn't that pretty?
It is.
We're going to figure out how to use it as an instruction manual for life with some assembly required. Because I know, does anybody feel like this with life sometimes?
Yeah.
You got the Bible version and everything looks beautiful and perfect, and then this is what it looks like on on Monday morning when you're trying to assemble life and you're trying to do life and live life. It does not always fit like we think it should. I don't know. Is that just me?
No.
Anybody else? Anybody else feel like that? That sometimes the ideal or the pretty picture doesn't fit my life and what I'm going through. So last time we talked about in our last Bible study, we started with be holy as I am holy. And God spoke clearly to the nation of Israel. He had chosen them, they were his chosen people. And now being chosen didn't mean that they were teacher's pet. They were chosen to be set apart and uniquely called to a specific purpose. And so that's what we talked about a lot in our holiness study that we did last time was being holy meant being set apart for a specific purpose. And if you remember the nation of Israel, um, their testimony as a nation, uh, they were like the least of who you thought you would pick to be a holy people. They messed up from day one. They were severely flawed, continually disobedient. They made horrible mistakes and were disrespectful to God, like over and over and over again. And in the middle of all that, God was still faithful to his promise, and he had promised to choose them as his people. And he showed compassion, he showed justice, he allowed them to suffer the consequences of sin at the same time preparing a way for their salvation. That's pretty awesome. That's in the Old Testament. But what about you? Because we're not in the Old Testament. We haven't been given the all the rules of Leviticus that we study that we looked at.
That is skip.
That's yeah, that we try to skip.
They're horrible.
We want to skip all that. So what about you? What about your calling? Because as a New Testament believer, God didn't save you just so that you could be teacher's pet or his favorite or whatever. You were saved. Uh, yes,
Yes.
God is calling. Um, Miss Pat has a phone call coming. Let me find out where I was at. God didn't save you to make you his, favorite teacher's pet or whatever. And here's another thing that we sometimes miss out on. You weren't saved just for heaven. Heaven is the promised land. That's a promised future at some future time. You were given that promised land. Uh, but meanwhile, you still have to live in this wilderness. The nation of Israel had the promised land that was coming, but they had to live in the wilderness for 40 years because of their disobedience. We still have to survive in this world. We have to live in this world in the everyday, day to day, even though we have been set apart for a specific purpose. And the one who created you, here's the thing that just blows my mind. The God who called me knew all the stupid, ignorant things I would ever do in my life, all the mistakes, all the missteps, all of the stuff. He called me anyway, even though he knew what was going to happen. He chose the nation of Israel, even though he knew what they were going to do. And he did the same thing for you and me. He chose us, he called us, even though he knew what we were going to do. So if we know that Romans 8:29 says, yes, Romans 8:29 says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. We were called, we were predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. We're supposed to be like Jesus. So, do you remember the first obstacle when we started studying about holiness? And God said, be holy as I am holy. And what was our first obstacle that we had to come up with, that we came up with?
Don't ask me, because you got us on spot. We couldn't even remember holy, holy, holy. Me and Joy, either one.
Holy. You know, when it says God says, be holy,
like I am.
our brain immediately says, well, that ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
That ain't going to happen. Because we know ourselves. Guess what? God does too. Why would God ask you to do something that was impossible? And that was our first obstacle that we had to overcome when we talked about holiness. So, if this is the New Testament challenge to be conformed to the image of his son, how can I possibly even attempt to be like Jesus? You know, the Jesus who never sinned, the Jesus who did all the stuff. Why would God ask a sinful person like me to be like Jesus? That's impossible, right? Look up Luke 137. It's on the screen.
Oh, okay. Nothing shall be impossible to God.
Nothing shall be impossible to God. So already your first thought in your head is, I can't be like Jesus. Why should I even bother? Because that's impossible. Nothing shall be impossible to God. How about this one? Does that, can I really? Can I be conformed to the image of his son? Yeah, because I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Through Christ who gives me strength. I can't do it on my own. And that's the best thing is you haven't been asked to do this on your own because God knows you can't do it on your own. But nothing's impossible to God. And I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. How about this one? 1 Peter 2:21 says, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. How about 1 John? 1 John 2:5, the second part of verse 5 says, by this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. So, your first assignment, I've got those on your handout, is I want you to mark those in your Bible. And I want you to figure out a way to mark them, not just underline them, if you want to underline them in a specific color or whatever, but something that's going to catch your eye that you'll know it came from this 10-week Bible study. So in my Bible, do you want to see what I got a little footprint next to the verse and marked it with a little footprint. which really only has four toes,
Yeah,
but little foot, a little footprint, so that when I'm turning through my Bible and I see the little footprint, I'll know that that came from the our Bible study on learning to follow the footsteps of Jesus. And so for the next few weeks, if you would figure out a way, it doesn't have to be a footprint if you don't think you can, draw a footprint or whatever way that you want to do it that will show you that, hey, this is where I've studied this verse before. So now I do want to tell you, John 8, chapter 12. That is our theme verse for this next 10 weeks. And y'all know what I feel, how I feel about pet verses, right? This is a pet verse alert because a pet verse, Cindy, if you haven't been in our Bible studies before, I'll tell you a pet verse is one that you cut it, you choose just enough letters to fit on where you need it to fit. So I needed this to fit on a banner. You'll find pet verses on t-shirts, you'll find them on bumper stickers, and what it is it just takes just those words that you need so that it will fit where you need it to fit. So John 8 chapter 12, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness but will have the light of life. That's not the whole verse. So this is what the whole verse says in John. That's where we're going to go right now. It's John chapter 8. So if you got your Bible, turn to John chapter 8. And it says, again, so that means, he's already said something. It says, again, Jesus spoke to them. Okay. So one of the rabbits we're going to need to chase is, who is he talking to? So again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So the first thing we're going to have to do is chase a couple of rabbits before we get into the thick of things. And so that means because it starts with again, you don't start a sentence with again. That means we have to back up a little bit to find out what's going on. Well, let me just tell you. In John chapter 8, they have, when he says he said to them, he's talking about the audience that was in John chapter 7. So if you look back to John chapter 7, verses 40 through 43, we're not going to read all of this, but in chapter 40, or in chapter 7, verses 40 through 43, we have the people who are gathered for the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles was one of three um, annual feasts that Jewish men were required to attend. And all the different feasts celebrated a different time, a different thing, and they had different rituals and all that stuff that went on during those feasts. So the people who are at the Feast of Tabernacles, all those people, and then you had religious leaders, and those religious leaders of all ranks, and Nicodemus was there. So in verse 50 of chapter 7, it says, Nicodemus, who had gone to him before and who was one of them, said to him, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he has done? And they replied, are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. And then verse 53 says, they each went to his own house. So this same audience, we're going to skip down to chapter 12, where it says, again, Jesus spoke to them. He's talking to this same audience. It could be a different day, could be the same day, but basically what was happening is they were looking for some way to trip up Jesus. Jesus was in the temple. He would leave at night and go to the Mount of Olives, and then he would come back in the morning and teach again in the temple common area. He would sit down and teach. And so this was happening. And while it's happening, the Pharisees and the religious leaders are trying to trip him up, and they're trying to find some kind of aha moment where they can discredit him.
Mount of Olives at night. They were sitting there and together, trying to pick something that he had said that day to trip him up the next day.
Possibly. Or they would go home and say, what can we figure out? What can we do? How can we trip up this guy? Because all these people are following him and all these people are thinking that he's the Messiah. And we don't want him to take away the attention from what we've been teaching them all this time. And we're going to lose our power over the people if we don't figure out some way to trip him up. This is what's happening in chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. Okay. And if you look in chapter 8, just before our theme verse, which is verse 12, chapter 8, let's read this together. And I want you to think about the characters. Okay. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say? They said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. And Jesus stood up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. Then again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, so we've got this story that's put there, kind of sort of like breaking it up in what's going on. Now, verses 1 through 11 of chapter 8, in some early manuscripts, this instance is actually missing. Some have tried to discredit this particular story, just because some of the early manuscripts don't have it at all. Some of them have it, but in a different location. But John placed it here for a reason. God has this story here for a reason. And of the four gospels, John is the only one who records this particular event. Not saying that it didn't happen, but there are some trains of thought or theologists or commentators or whatever that says when they were writing down the copying transcripts of the Bible early manuscripts, they didn't want to put this one in. Let me read what I wrote. Says some think the early manuscripts omit the description for the same reason the Pharisees used the woman caught in adultery as an attempted trap, because of its titillating nature. So some people think they left it out because it was so titillating, which is the same reason that's why they picked this particular thing. They didn't care about this woman. They didn't care about this woman. They only cared about trying to trip up Jesus. And so it gives, I know that so many of us appreciate this event being in the Bible because it gives us some hope that in the darkest place and the worst sin, Jesus reminds us that he did not come to condemn us. He came to provide the only way that we could be forgiven. And so did the woman that was caught in adultery, did she deserve to die? Yes. According to the law, she deserved death. According to the law God gave Moses, she deserved to die. The, they wanted to trip him up, but she still deserved death. And the covenant law that God gave Moses proved that she was completely inadequate to defend herself or save herself. Right? No hope. She deserved to die. The law of Moses said she deserved to die. She was guilty without hope, this in her darkest moment, and she was set free with an instruction: go and sin no more. Go, the word go is poriuomahi. Does anybody know how to pronounce that in Greek? Well, then that's right. The Greek word go means to travel, to remove from a place or take a journey. I think if we're going to follow some footsteps, we got to take a journey. But sometimes we look at that go and sin no more as an impossible task. It's impossible for us to go and sin no more. I wrote this. I said, when face to face with darkness and sin and temptation, what would she remember? You think she'd remember that she dodged a bullet? That she got off scot-free? That the man who could have joined with the crowd and demanded her life as righteous payment for her offense instead chose to offer her a second chance? See, that's what motivates us to the sin no more, is recognizing. See, because we want to feel sorry for her, because the Pharisees were just using her. They were just using her to try and trip Jesus up. But just because they were using her to trip Jesus up doesn't mean she still wasn't a sinner. It doesn't mean she was innocent. There was no doubt she was guilty. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't matter how good you've been in your whole life, how many perfect attendance stickers you have for church attendance, you are still a sinner that needs salvation. And you are still needing that. Neither do I condemn you. We read the story, and if you're going to read the story correctly, you would need to fill in the blank with your sin. She was caught in adultery. That was her sin. It was obvious. It was plastered. She had the big red letter A. We all have sin. We all have it. And we love the message, neither do I condemn you. Because we just love to know that Jesus didn't come to condemn us. And we skip over the instruction. Because Jesus said, let's set her free. Sin no more. When it says go and sin no more, you're like, well, there's the strings. That sounds like strings attached. Are there strings attached to forgiveness? No. There are no strings attached. Jesus forgave her and then gave her an instruction. And we look at that, if sin no more is the requirement, I'm doomed. Because I'm going to sin again. But when you realize that what you really deserved was death, and you accept the salvation that Jesus gave, that changes your motivation to be able to go and sin. You know what? I don't want to be that person that takes advantage of this forgiveness I've been given. So we all, let me see if I can find Um, this says, I wrote this, I can't receive the forgiveness because I'm a flawed individual and I can pretty much guarantee I will sin again. I should gather my tattered, filthy robes and hide somewhere because let's face it, a dramatic rescue from the jaws of certain death, well, that doesn't come around more than once in a lifetime. If go and sin no more is the requirement, I'm doomed for the rest of my life, the rest of my miserable life. Then comes verse 12. That's why I think that even though some theologians say that verse 1 through 11 doesn't belong there, this is why I think it really does. Verse 12 says, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. To the sinner, go and sin no more would be impossible without Jesus. To the religious leaders, all those rules and regulations, that didn't bring light. And then you've got all the people who are in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. Let me tell you something really kind of cool, okay? The Feast of Tabernacles took about a week. During the feast, toward the evening, there were traditionally four very large candelabras. We sometimes call them menorah. We don't know for certain what the shape of them were. This picture shows some lights up there, but these four large candelabras would be erected in the court of women, which was basically the common place where everybody could go. They had the court of women, which was, like the public place where everybody could be. And then there were other places where only men could go, and then other places where only priests could go, and so on and so forth. So this was in the most common area. They would have these four large candelabra. Some descriptions of them have them as much as 75 feet tall. That's pretty huge. The lights represented God's presence because the Feast of Tabernacles was supposed to remind them, the Feast of Booths was supposed to remind them of the 40 years that they wandered in the wilderness. And during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, God's presence was with them over the tabernacle in a pillar of fire. So this was to represent that pillar of fire. And so in chapter 7, it says the last night of the feast. So this would have been chapter 8 would have been in the last night of the feast. And the menorah or the candelabras had been fully lit. The new illumination in the temple would have been a very stark contrast to the darkness outside the temple area. So anyone who left the festival to travel home would be walking in darkness as soon as they left the temple. As soon as they left the temple, they would be walking in darkness. And Jesus was offering an invitation. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Now, what if instead of go, what if Jesus says, let's go? That's where we are. We're getting ready to start this promise. If you follow him, you will not walk in darkness. So for the next few weeks, we're going to learn what it means to follow in his footsteps. So we got the first obstacle, of course, is that you have to be perfect, right? If you're going to be like Jesus, Jesus was perfect. So as part of your homework, I'm going to ask you to read Romans chapter 8, where it says to be conformed to the image of his son. And just like the Old Testament, where we're called to be holy, we think that's impossible. And we think of being like Jesus as being something that we can never attain. So why are we beating ourselves up, trying to achieve something that we'll never be? So I want you to, yeah, there we go. Romans chapter 8. I want you to read the whole chapter of Romans chapter 8, which is fantastic, by the way. Um, and I want you to make a list. Okay. You ready to make a list? What are the things that Jesus did that you know you absolutely can't do? Okay. Live a sinless life. There's one. Can any of you work miracles, raise people from the dead, um, give blind men their sight? I mean, if you were an optician or, a optometrist and you healed somebody's cataract, maybe did surgery, whatever, but that's not a miracle. That's science. So, work miracles, live a sinless life. Can you die for the sins of the world? No, not me either. Can you raise from the dead? Not on your own. No, no, that's not it. So that about covers it, right? Those are the things that you can't do. Guess what? You haven't been called to do any of those things, but you have been called to be conformed to the image of his. So we're going to figure out, what does that look like? What is it? What is the image of Jesus, the image of the Son that I can be conformed to? And I want to tell you one more story before we end. And that is about a rabbi. Okay. We don't really get the whole rabbi student thing because we think of school. Okay. And a rabbi is a teacher. Obviously, a rabbi is a teacher. But a rabbi uh, would teach their students. Okay, let me read this where I read. I did some rabbit chasing, and all Jewish boys started school at around 5 or 6 years old. Okay. Most girls, if they did learn anything, it was at home, not in a school setting. Just because tradition was that they wouldn't need to know how to read to be able to be mothers and wives and do the things that they were supposed to do. And so generally they educated the boys, not the girls. I know it's not fair, but that's, aren't you glad you're born in this century and not then? So the boys would start school around 5 or 6 years old, and most of them would drop out around 10 or 11 years old. So 10 or 11 years old, they would drop out to begin a trade. They would generally do what was like the family business. And so they did get some education from the ages of 5 to about 11. And those who were good at it got to continue. So those that weren't any good at studying the Torah or the Old Testament, the books, um, most Jewish boys would have memorized because they didn't have the ability to write everything down and take notes and carry a notebook home or whatever. They memorized Torah. All that stuff in Leviticus that we can't even bear to read. A lot of them would memorize it. Can you believe it? So anyway, those who were the top of their class, a rabbi, if he was going to continue their education, he would choose the best students, and those students would be his talmidim, or his basically his followers. Also, another word for that is disciples. They would be his disciples. So the best students of Torah would become his disciples, and they would follow him everywhere he goes. They would learn to study Torah the way he studies Torah. It would be like an apprentice. They would watch everything he does. They would wear their cape thing the way he does. They would wrap their turban the way he does. They would tie a tie the way he does, because they would follow their rabbi with everything. And some students followed their rabbi as many as 15 years or more. And their goal in following a rabbi was to become like that rabbi, to become him. So when a young man was chosen to follow a rabbi, his family would send him off because he was going to go live. He wouldn't come home anymore. He was following that rabbi everywhere. And they would give him a blessing. And the blessing was, may you be covered with the dust of your rabbi, meaning walk so close to him that the dust he produces or spits up or whatever lands on you. That's how close you want to be to your rabbi. So my question is, are you ready to be covered in the dust of your rabbi? I'm not your rabbi, by the way, not me. Jesus. If we're going to be conformed to the image of, that's what a Talmudim did, was conform to the image of his rabbi. So that when the rabbi was ready to pass the mantle on to his student, then his student, he knew, would follow everything the way he taught him and would do the things he taught him to do. That's how he would know he was ready to be a teacher himself. So are you ready to be covered in the dust of your rabbi?
Yes.
I'm so excited. So your homework, you're going to read John chapter 8, the whole John chapter 8. And I want you to mark any words or think about words that indicate forward movement, like walking, following, sending, going, coming, etc. Um, just try and be, aware of those words. Okay. And then you're also going to read Romans chapter 8, if you find any of those words in there. Um, and if there's any words that indicate how we should live or make life choices, okay, just see if you can mark those. And then I want you to spend some time this week identifying any obstacles to following Jesus that you have in your life. And I want you to note any obstacles that are impossible for God to remove. That makes sense?
I mean, there's nothing that's impossible.
Here's the thing. We're going to think about those obstacles and we're going to go, oh, well, I can't be like Jesus because of this, or because of this, or because of this. And then try and say, wait a minute, is that obstacle impossible for God?
I would love to have been her and not done what she did, but to sit there and watch Jesus ask each of those men who were supposed to be learned men, uh, cast the first stone. And none of them could. They each turned and walked away. And then you got to be her and sitting there and thinking, well, boy, if I'm this bad and they can kill me, they can't even do it because evidently they've done worse than I have. And he turned every one of them away. And then all he asked of her was to just go and sin no more. That's not easy. That's what he told her.
Go and remember where you could have been.
Mm-hmm.
You could have been stoned to death, and you deserved to be stoned to death. And here's the thing that you and I have to recognize and remember: my sin deserves death. I deserve to die. I was saved when I was about 7, so I was very young, and the only thing I really knew was that I didn't want to go to hell, and that my whole family was going to go to heaven, and I wanted to go with them. So I didn't understand everything, but I knew I didn't want to go to hell, and I wanted to go to heaven, and I asked Jesus to save me. But it wasn't until I was about 20 that I realized that I was realizing that I really had done some messed up stuff in my life, and I really don't understand why God hadn't just, God should have just killed me. I just deserve to die. And a very wise man that I married, by the way, said, "You're right," which is not what I was thinking he would say on, the second or third date, but he said, "You're right. You do deserve to die." And that's why Jesus died. And I had always known that Jesus died for the sins of the world, but it wasn't until I was 20 years old that I realized that sin, that that the Pharisees had accused me of, that I was guilty of, that I deserved death. I deserved the same thing that that woman brought in the act of adultery before Jesus deserved. And that Jesus forgave me and said, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Go and choose to live and follow different. So we're going to talk about that over the next 10 weeks. Anybody else excited?
Yes.
Yes.
You have a heart attack if you got excited as me. I do have a tendency to get a little excited. And the heads, you like that? My PowerPoint pictures. You know, I work really hard on that. Oh. So I want you to think, instead of go, I want you to think of Jesus reaching his hand out and saying, sister, let's go. Let's go. Follow my footsteps. And let's get so close that the dust of the rabbi gets all up in our self, all up over the place, that we get in the dust of the rabbi. We want Jesus to get all up in our business. That's right. You know, you're gonna follow in his footsteps. You're gonna he's gonna be all up in your business. So okay, I'm gonna stop the recording and then we can keep chit-chatting. But if you're joined us for recording, for this recording, we're glad you joined us, and we hope you join us next time when we do lesson 2.